Please. Please don't. Please.
Beside the fact that The Last of Us's intro credits scene is very aesthetically pleasing and cool, and that the big man Neil Druckmann himself has said that it's only really there for a better transition between the prologue and the main story, and the fact that it consists of about only 14 lines of dialogue, it actually does a lot of world building. Hey stragglers and tourists, my name is TheiPadCat, and in today's video we're going to take a closer look at the intro credits scene of The Last of Us. But before we do that, I'm just going to be annoying and plug my Discord server and Twitter really quick. You'll find those links in the description. But without further ado, let's
Get on with it.
So, The Last of Us focuses a great deal of what is the present in their timeline, and on the relationship between Joel and Ellie. Who would have thought? The world around them is merely a backdrop, both in gameplay and story. Although there are bits of lore here and there, on the reality outside of the main story, they usually focus on personal stories and not really on the world as a whole. There are even fewer bits of information that tell us what made the world get to this stage it is in when we start 20 years after the outbreak. Therefore, lore-wise, the 14 lines of dialogue in the intro credits scene are very interesting. It can, with a little interpretation and imagination, give us a picture of what happened at the very beginning of the apocalypse, and albeit very slight, backstory on some of the factions. Let's take a look at the first line.
The number of confirmed deaths has passed 200. The governor has called a state of emergency.
There are a few interesting things in this line. Firstly, let's talk about those confirmed deaths. What did those people die from? From what we know, CBI or Cordyceps brain infection usually doesn't kill its host until way later in the cycle. It's supposed to infect other hosts as long as the body allows it. Then, find an enclosed space where it can die and turn into one of those disgusting fungus piles to release spores into the air, and continue spreading to new hosts even in death. Just killing the host outright doesn't serve either of those purposes, so I see 4 possibilities of how this is possible. 1. CBI worked differently at the onset of the outbreak. It was stronger and therefore killing most of its hosts outright, and only later evolved to work the way we see it in the main story. 2. As people who got infected were taken to hospitals and then got aggressive, police or military might have been called, and when they found out that infected individuals couldn't be reasoned with, they were killed. 3. The infected just killed a lot of people while trying to infect them, like we see them kill Joel when we fail in the main story. Or 4. A mix of all 3. To be honest, we can all probably agree that the outbreak was very tumultuous, and in all of that chaos, infected were probably killing people as well as making new people infected, at the same time as riots were in progress. And the authorities were probably desperate in their efforts to stop the spread, as well as the unrest, and therefore resorted to violence, thus the 200 dead. The part about the governor calling a state of emergency is also quite interesting. Firstly, it probably means that all of the confirmed deaths were within one state. And secondly, and more interestingly, it supports the hinted at notion from the game's prologue and some parts of the main story that the outbreak wasn't really nationwide and maybe not even worldwide, at the start at least, unlike many other post-apocalyptic universes, like The Walking Dead or Fallout. In the car, Tommy says,
"They got no clue. But we ain't the only town. First they're saying it's just the south. Now they're going on about the east coast, the west coast."
And in Bill's town, Joel says, These two lines, with the one from the intro credits scene, makes it seem like the Outbreak was a drawn-out event and not something happening really fast. It might also be, though, that this particular news broadcast was from a local news network, therefore reporting only on what's happening in the state.
Hundreds and hundreds of bodies lining the streets.
This line also makes me wonder the same thing as with the previous one. What did they die from? Though the phrase lining the streets reminds me a lot of how bodies lay everywhere at the hospital in The Walking Dead Season 1, and over the whole of New York City in The Division. And that makes me think that these bodies were infected, and not rioters or civilians, that the authorities were struggling to dispose of in their quarantine efforts. What's strange though is that the government in The Last of Us' world actually seem very prepared in comparison to, for example, The Walking Dead. They could set up quarantine zones in time, organize evacuations and so on. Disposing of infected corpses seems like it would be very high up on the list of things to do in order to prevent spreading of the disease. And from what we see in The Last of Us' story, it actually seems like they did dispose of the bodies lining the streets, since we see no rows of skeletons anywhere in the game. So why were the bodies lining the streets in the first place? I mean, I would imagine circumstances would get worse and worse as time progresses, so if the authorities couldn't handle disposing these bodies while they were still somewhat strong, how come they could when they were weaker later on? Okay, this is hurting my brain. I'm probably overthinking it. What we can take away from this line in the end though is that for bodies to literally line the streets, people were dying very fast at the start of the outbreak, which would contradict it being a slow event. Okay, let's just continue.
Panic spread worldwide after a leaked report from the World Health Organization showed that the latest vaccination tests have failed.
This line yet again reinforces the notion that the fall of civilization took a long time to happen. For panic to spread worldwide, extensive modern communication would still have to exist, like internet, television and so on. How else could a report leak, spread across the world, and then cause a reaction that was then reported back on in the US? I don't really understand how this works story-wise though, since communications actually seem to go down almost immediately on Outbreak Day. The phone line cuts off just as Sarah answers Tommy's call.
Hello?
Sarah, honey, I need to get your daddy on the phone.
Uncle Tommy, what time is it?
I need to talk to your dad now. There's something...
Uncle Tommy? Hello?
Joel's smartphone has no coverage or signal or whatever.
There's his phone. 8 missed calls. Where the hell are you? Call me on my way.
And the radio in the car doesn't work.
Can we hear us on the radio?
Yeah, sure thing.
Thanks.
No cell phone, no radio. Yeah, we're doing great. A minute ago, newsman wouldn't shut up.
Now, of course, there could have been a period of relative stability after the initial shock of the outbreak, during which all of these things temporarily returned. I think this is very likely because the authorities were prepared enough to set up quarantine zones almost all over the country and organize an effort to prevent society from completely falling. Initially, that probably meant keeping as much of society, including communications, working for as long as possible. Now, either they disappeared because things got drastically worse again, or because of changed priorities. All of this dialogue in the intro credits seem to take place in some intermediate period between the world we know and the apocalypse of The Last of Us' main story. Which makes me want that Joel and Tommy standalone even more.
With the bureaucrats out of power, we can finally take the necessary steps.
I'd like to see this line as the beginning of the FEDRA faction, or at least the FEDRA that we know in the main story, as it technically existed as a part of the US government before the apocalypse. They were probably called in at an earlier stage to aid in the relief effort across the country. But at this press event, or whatever it is, it's announced that things have gotten extreme enough that they're now in complete control. These measures exist in the real world too. Martial law can be declared, and in even worse scenarios, there is something called Directive 51, which is there to ensure continuity of government in catastrophic circumstances. This is what the division is based on, for example. Although I don't think the transition from the system in our world to the FEDRA dictatorship went through entirely as it was intended to. I don't really have anything to base it on apart from these intro credits, but I think somewhere FEDRA committed a sort of coup d'etat, where they took control by other means than just the president activating Directive 51, or the Senate or Congress or whatever voted for martial law. Why else would there be such riots? Why else would the Fireflies form to restore the government? Why else would civilians hate the only thing standing between them and a total wasteland full of infected?
Los Angeles is now the latest city to be placed under martial law.
I hate to sound like a broken record, but here it is again. Why would Los Angeles be the latest city to be placed under martial law if the outbreak was sudden and nationwide / global at first? One would think that the second largest city in the US would be one of the first places to fall, but it seems like what Joel says about some places getting a heads up before the outbreak was legit. The CBI came from tainted crops in South America, so maybe it started there and gradually made its way north. This slow spread may be what contributed to the authorities being so much more prepared than in other post-apocalyptic universes. I mean, if all hell breaks loose with some disease in Texas, why wouldn't they prepare for the worst in other places like California and Massachusetts?
All residents are required to report to their designated quarantine.
Beside the point of the authorities being prepared and all that jazz I've been going on about, what's interesting about this line is the all residents part. If you remember, upon arriving in Pittsburgh and getting to the checkpoint entrance, there are a lot of cars with corpses in them. If you engage in the optional conversation with Ellie when she asks what happened there, Joel says that he believes the military mowed them down, stating that they sacrificed a few to save the many. If all residents were required to report to their designated quarantine zone, why weren't they let in when they got there? It's possible that FEDRA had miscalculated how many people were still alive, or that they suspected they were infected, or that they were just as heartless as Joel said they were and just killed them because they could get infected.
Riots have continued for a third consecutive day, and winter rations are at an all-time low.
What's interesting about this line is that they say winter rations are at an all-time low. Now, as we all know, winter only happens once a year. For them to be at an all-time low, there had to have been previous winters when the ration situation wasn't as bad. And this voice sounds like a news broadcast. Does this mean that the outbreak or the intermediate phase I was talking about took place over a couple of years? Since there are still communications several winters after the zones were established. I mean, that makes it even more unique. In The Walking Dead, the world falls in a matter of weeks. The same can be said for the Division, and in Fallout it only takes a couple of hours.
A group calling themselves the Fireflies have claimed responsibility for both attacks.
This line is the very first mention of the Fireflies in The Last of Us lore. The fact that we still hear a news anchor's voice telling us this means this took place somewhere in the beginning years when communication still existed. Now, since this line is directly after the line about riots, and we hear about attacks, my view is that the Fireflies started out as rioters who then got more organized over time, until they could carry out attacks like this newsman is talking about. If you want a more in-depth video on that and other Firefly related things, you can watch this video I made a while ago.
Their public charter calls for the return of all branches of government.
Demonstrations broke out following the execution of 6 more alleged Fireflies.
You can still rise with us. Remember, when you're lost in the darkness, look for the light. Believe in the Fireflies.
I compiled these last few lines because there's not enough to say about them individually, but what is read to us during these seconds is the infancy of the Fireflies as an organization. We hear their original goal as a faction, to restore the government, and how they quickly managed to get the public with them as demonstrations broke out when they executed members. What is most interesting here though is that they had a public charter, and the fact that we can hear Marlene's voice over what could be radio or TV. The Fireflies can't be a centralized organization in the post-apocalyptic world, yet we see signs of their presence everywhere we go in the game. How come they can have such a large organization without modern communication? Well, my theory on the matter is that during these intermediate years, the Fireflies started out in one city, maybe Boston, and hijacked radio signals and maybe even made demands on the internet and so on, and inspired other people in other parts of the country to join the Fireflies, despite them not meeting the original organization in person. Then, when communications went down, the Fireflies were everywhere thanks to having spread their message while it was still possible. But that's just what I think. What do you think about the intro credits scene in The Last of Us? Tell me in the comments down below and let's discuss it. I'm just trying to find stuff to discuss in the information drought on The Last of Us Part 2 on Naughty Dog's part, so I hope you enjoyed this video. And until next time, have a great day.